Well, my name is Albert Mike Futo, and I go by Mike, but my dad's name was Albert. He was born in 1932, so he was too young to participate in World War II, but 1956, he would have been about 24-ish, and literally a crazy adventure with the revolution, or it was an uprising more than a revolution, and then escaping from communism. Well, I'm a first-generation American, so therefore I grew up in a house in America where my parents spoke Hungarian all the time. And so I learned Hungarian from a young age, and then my parents also sent me back to Europe, and I was there. I've been in Europe 6 times, and 3 of those times as a child. And my great-grandfather actually lived in Belleville, Illinois, nearby. And he came over right before World War I started. Now, I didn't get to know my great-grandfather that well, but we visited him often. It was a lot of fun. In specific, my dad grew up in Mezőkövesd, Hungary. He had worked on the railroads as a teenager and earned money for the family that way. He was in the military when the uprising happened in 1956. The Soviets were very oppressive, and this was a way to kind of get the message out that things need to change. He participated in that uprising, and so when the Soviets did finally put down the uprising, then he had to leave. So being in the military and participating in the uprising, it was not a good thing. So after that uprising was put down, my dad stayed in Budapest for a couple days trying to figure out what was going on, and then he took off for Austria. And so he crossed at the bridge at Andau, which is a book written by James Michener describing the sort of the method that people would get out of Hungary. So my dad talked a little bit about that, and he hitched a ride on a pickup truck, and then they sort of took all the back roads they could take until they got to the border, and then they crossed the border, and it went fairly smoothly for him. Now, there are reasons why he went back to Hungary in a month, because other people were coming out saying, yeah, the border's still open. But he had a girlfriend back home in Mezőkövesd, and he also wanted to resign his military commission rather than just leave. So he went back, said goodbye to all of his friends and family, and left. But then by then the border had been kind of shut down. So it was mid-December-ish. And so he went down south towards the Yugoslavian border. And then he got picked up in Yugoslavia and put into a refugee camp there. And then he actually escaped from that and got back into Austria. They weren't happy that he had gone back, so now he wasn't really a political refugee. Now he was more of a economic refugee, or what? They didn't know how to classify him. But they took him back anyways, and then he was there in Austria for a year. And he was I believe he was in the Linz refugee camp. And then about a year later, then he got permission to come to America. And that's in part because my great-grandfather was already here. So while he was in Austria, learned to speak German and learned how to drive a truck. And then when he got to America, then he had to kind of start all over again and learn English. And he stayed with my great-grandfather for a while. Then he got out on his own and worked a couple of odd jobs. And then he finally ended up getting a union job at the St. Louis Car Company. And that really is what kicked off his ability to earn some money and raise a family. He got laid off from there in the mid-70s because they closed. And then he worked a couple odd jobs and ended up working for Bi-State then as a diesel mechanic. And that was his dream, was to become a automotive repair diesel mechanic. And then he was able to finally get to do that. Well, we attended both the German and Hungarian festivities in the United States, but mostly we went to St. Mary's of Victory's Church, which was the Catholic mission to the Hungarian refugees. It was obviously the only Hungarian community in the St. Louis area, so that would have been straightforward for my dad to join that. and I was an altar boy there, so I was immersed in the culture, enjoyed it. It was really fascinating. There's a whole lot of stories to tell about St. Mary's of Victories in those days. However, I was young, and so I don't remember things as clearly, and I don't really remember people's names really well, and I really wish we had a photo directory of the church at that time. As an altar boy, so I got the perspective of the Mass from behind the scenes, in a sense. So we were always running late, and always trying to get in there in time, get dressed, and then go in. And if we showed up late, well, we would just walk out and start helping, doing what we're supposed to do. And I was so embarrassed all the time. As an adult, right, who cares, But as a kid, you feel like you're in front of everybody and you're not showing up on time, and everybody's looking at you thinking about you. Nobody's thinking about you, they're just thinking about the Mass and all that's going on, but I was very self-conscious about all that. So there was, we had obviously, some festivals. It was mainly Catholic-oriented festivals, but every March 15th and every October 23rd, we would celebrate and have speeches and things. The kids would get up and say some verses, Hungarian verses, but also Mother's Day and things like that, where we would speak Hungarian and have more of a presentation in front of the church. So the October festival was about the uprising, and it was very strong. Everyone there was part of that uprising. In that church at that time were mostly Hungarians who had come out during the '56 uprising. March 15th, though, is about the 1848-49 uprising. There were a lot of revolutions happening in Europe at that time. So people were yearning for freedom, and there was a lot of old monarchies that were still keeping their thumb on the people. So they also had a dance group at the Hungarian church, and they met on Saturdays. Now, I didn't participate in that because my dad couldn't necessarily get us down there on a Saturday evening or afternoon. But there was a lot of the kids participated in the Hungarian dance group. And they had a Hungarian school they set up in the basement. So some of the kids went down there and learned a little bit of Hungarian every Sunday. And all that adds up, And so after church every Sunday, in the community center next door, the Catholics, they have a bar there and they have tables, and if there was a dinner being served, that was in the dining area. But after in the bar area, some of the guys would get around and they would play cards after church on Sunday. So, they would take the cards, as they're playing, and they would slam it down on the table, like, I'm going to trump you or whatever you got. And they would do that. They were so emotionally involved, and it was just an amazing thing to watch. Gosh, I think back on it, I just wish we had some videos, but of course it's in our memories. It's better than it was in real life. Because at the time it was like, why are those guys so loud?
Yeah.
But it stands out in your memory. It's one of those things that was it was emotional, and it was fun, actually, in a way. As an adult, I would really have enjoyed getting involved with that. But my dad never played the cards with those guys. So my dad was always having conversations with people, so we would always be leaving church late. And as a kid, you can only handle so much of that. But we would do crazy things, like we'd walk down to the arch, come back an hour later. I climbed up in the belfry, and it's all crickety 100-year-old wood that you're trying to go through and hoping you won't break through and fall through the floor or anything like that. And just stuff like that. It really does tie into a larger question of lots of other Catholic churches shutting down, and less and less people going to church, as well as to the economic decline around downtown areas. I am for St. Mary's of Victories making it in the future and being able to minister to people. There's thoughts of revitalizing that area. So Laclede's Landing was revitalized in my lifetime, became a reasonable economic center. But the south side of the arch hasn't really been redeveloped yet. But they're working on it. I mean, these are larger questions that I don't think that there's great answers for. The question about whether or not the downtown area is, they're trying to revitalize it, right? But that's just what it's always been. They're building the Geospatial Center on the north side of St. Louis. And that will, put a couple of city blocks of infrastructure change, and then of course the surrounding community will get a lot of the employees will want to live nearby there. So that'll revitalize the North St. Louis area a bit. But again, what's going to happen with the south side of the arch there? That's a whole nother thing, urban planning, and don't know the answer, because if you have government money spent on it, does it really survive? Or, the idea is to get some government investment, but then also have some private investment that carries on and sustains the effort.